As we start Module 2, I want to take a few moments to draw your attention to the student learning outcomes here in our module. As, as I think is often the case, sometimes you take a class where you're not really sure why you're doing what you're doing in the class, and it doesn't seem to really connect. So I want to be sure that you understand there are a handful of reasons why we do some of the things we do in this class, and specifically there are 6 goals we have, at least in this module, and if you go backwards to Module 1 you'll see the same. But for our purposes, the kinds of assignments you're working on build in this module from the previous module's efforts, how to take good notes or how to read a text in a specific kind of way, and we're going to build on those with 6 new learning outcomes. That means by the end of the module you should be more familiar with these concepts and feel more comfortable with, 1, discussing them, reflecting on them, but 2, also enacting them. So plain style writing techniques, and really this is a revision tool. No one talks plainly, no one writes plainly. Instead, we write and talk how we write and talk, and we revise. We take that opportunity to listen to our reader or our instinct about what our reader can understand, and we say, okay, well, if he doesn't get it or she doesn't get it, maybe we should come back to that sentence and figure out why not. And oftentimes we avoid listening to our readers and don't take their feedback seriously because they can't enunciate exactly why they don't understand the sentence. It's enough for us that they don't understand it, and we should listen to that and be grateful for that kindness. Pointing out that idea. If something doesn't make sense to someone, there's likely, more often than not, a problem with the sentence syntax, its arrangement of parts. So plain language revision is something we employ to go back to focus on, well, 1, putting our reader first. We're writing for another to communicate an idea. It may make sense to us right now as we write it, and we may be upset that it doesn't make sense to somebody else, but if our goal is to make it make sense, we want to make sure we're concerning ourselves with the reader's ability to understand that. And there are really just 2 principles that go into this: character and action. You've heard me say this before, and I'll say it again throughout the rest of the term. When you put humans first in a sentence, whether it's literally the first word or as the first sentence subject, you do your reader a favor by emphasizing who. Human beings, with our brains being wired the way they are, like whos. We like having characters that we can follow a story about, even if it's a summary story. Second, in putting the action word, we call this a verb normally, but that action into the verb slot, so the reader understands what's happening. What is the character doing? For example, Swift writes, Bogle argues, Adler and Van Doren discuss. This idea of character and subject paired together. This helps our reader by focusing their attention with an easy-to-understand component, so as a sentence gets longer and we include more complicated information, the reader has momentum built into the sentence. So it's a kind thing for us to do, to consider how we can revise for plainness, and that's something you'll work on in this module. We'll continue this idea of self-directed revision strategies, but basically we have to admit sometimes that the things we try to do don't always work to the ends we want. So things that may have worked last year in another class or in high school or 10 years ago when you first started writing, and it's been a while since you've been back in the classroom, maybe they work well, but maybe they don't work well here. And so you kind of have the opportunity to kind of explode this thing and look at it more finely and see, what kinds of questions am I asking? What kind of revision strategies am I employing? I give you the opportunity in the course to discuss this for yourself as peer review, reflection, revise, all these different kinds of elements for you to take time. Writing a 250-word paragraph is not a difficult task. It is when it's a difficult paragraph to summarize a difficult text, but the idea is it's a short text. That means you can work on it once a day if you really want to. You can go through 10 drafts if you really want to. It's such a short draft. The draft's not really what's important, it's the process that you're enacting as you revise it. So take the peer review seriously, get good feedback, and take advantage of the kindness of your peers and return that kindness in caring for their drafts. And you'll find that as you develop this revision strategy, you can also speed it up. Right now, we're trying to be slow. We're trying to do this idea of slow culture. Practice why it's working the way it is. Refine the things that aren't quite working, or maybe try on a new tool and see if you can make it work. And then you can collapse it and speed it up as you get further into the course. This kind of builds on the first project, but analytic theses. An analytic thesis is one that's, well, it's not summary. The sky is blue. I like pizza. These are kinds of statements that we describe as summary statements. I'm going to talk about the movie The Interview. Okay, these are the kinds of statements that don't succeed in conveying analysis to a reader, because Well, they don't include any analysis. No choice is being made, no pattern is being observed. So I always use the example of UNF parking lots. UNF, its parking lots offer too few spaces. Great. Okay, so we've inventoried some sort of feature, we've counted on our hand or a calculator the number of spots UNF has maybe and the number of students it has, and we've said, well, there are more students and spaces and we can't park. So we're pointing out an issue, but we're not quite there to the point of analyzing it. So when we ask what questions and we inventory a text, we talk about the features of that text really that are surface that anyone can see and agree upon. The how question is that next one, that argument of should or ought to-ness. So that ought to-ness is what kind of gives us the idea we're really getting at. You should see the film The Interview as a satirical text. I should? Well, I guess I could disagree with that. No, I shouldn't. But the opportunity to disagree is your opportunity to find analysis, because that's what's taking place. I think that film is funny. That's borderline summary, borderline analysis. The film is funny. Now all of a sudden we're getting to more towards the analysis part of it. And when we add this implication of this so what, because UNF has too few parking spaces, UNF should increase its parking option. Why? Well, so students can get to class on time, for example. So that idea of the value of the claim you're trying to make or argue, that's what's really important. So when you argue that a text is funny, well, so what? Why would one argue that? And that's what you were trying to get at in that first paper. Many of you did successfully, at least implicitly, get at that idea. So when you look at the rubrics for a thesis, remember, you're trying to consider, how do I get from summary, this text is a meme, okay, to some sort of argument, this text satirizes this other text. Great, now we can disagree, right? That's the idea. You're trying to put out an idea that's argumentative and somehow calls on you to make some sort of analytic choice, which brings us to the next idea of inventorying a text. So take a step backwards. These are all what questions, and when we talk about texts in our class, we mean any sort of thing that's made. Text is just a textile. A computer is a text, a t-shirt is a text, a window is a text, a classroom is a text. These are all things that are put together. When we describe them, we have all the senses available to us, right? So words, sounds, images, textures, layers, colors. So sound, vision, touch, these really sensory features that we could use to explain how a text works. Think of the Mona Lisa, La Gioconda. You look at this and it has certain colors, certain line work, certain perspective, certain framework, and size. And you think about, these are all fact statements that people really aren't going to disagree about. They're going to make a list of these things, and when we start seeing these features, we can start drawing some sort of conclusions about them. But the inventorying is that first step. That's just identifying what a text is. So when you inventory your meme, that's something you're going to want to be doing, is not analyzing it, not looking for meaning or evaluating its quality, but looking at its features, its sensory features. How big is it? What kind of language does it use? What kind of font does it use? What kind of kerning between the letters of the font? What's the contrast between the colors in the document or the text? All these different things you can ask about any single text you want. And if you have an issue with that, talk to me. I'm sure we can find an example that you already do this with every day. Whether it's fashion, whether it's looking at a room and decorating it, it doesn't matter. Coding PHP, it really doesn't matter. We're always inventorying texts, and this is why it's so hard to slow down and do. The human brain is just so fast at reading that for us to stop and inventory the text takes energy, but it's something valuable to do for note-taking. But once we inventory a text, we can analyze the text for certain features, right? So we have these print and media texts, and that's just another way of saying anything that's written, composed, compiled, put together, not naturally occurring. When you read a meme, it's different than reading a novel. We agree, right? You don't sit down and read a meme for 3 months and say, yep, I finished that meme finally. That'd be silly. Although it'd be kind of an interesting conversation after the fact. But you can look at it in different ways. Its size, the geography, the relationship of contents, the continents of information on there, right? What pieces comprise it, so you can ask questions again, going back to the inventorying a text. The relationship of the parts. So when you read this meme, you think about how it satirizes another text or historical text or calls on it to do something. You're putting information into conversation, which is analysis. So you're trying to really get this idea of how these things work, and that how is the analysis idea, and that's what we're working on in this module. And then finally, evidence in your arguments. This is something that's very hard for some to discuss and understand, but I think really it's an easy idea. Evidence is not about volume. there is an aspect of enough evidence, sure, but evidence really is three features. It's not here's a quote, now you know what I mean, right? It's here's a quote and here's some context or who said that quote and why that's important. Here's me exploring or explicating what that quote means, and here's me evaluating in terms of what it means in terms of my argument. So if you think like, oh, I'm just going to put a quote in there and that'll be my evidence, well, that's like the first step, right? You have really what's going to happen here is a sandwich moment of evidence exploration and evaluation, where your evidence really is just the tip of the iceberg. It's a sentence. I generally suggest a 1-to-3 ratio. For every piece of evidence, every sentence of evidence, you're going to have 3 sentences that follow that, that explain it, that articulate it, that give it value. So as you're going through your project 2 and your project 3 or any project in general in the future, think about it's not about how much evidence you have on the page. Maybe it's one piece per paragraph, maybe it's 2 words in a paragraph you're using as evidence. It's how you discuss it and connect it back to your argument. All too frequently, I'll leave a note on a student draft saying, you have a great idea, but you stopped and moved on to the next point, and you didn't explore it because in all likelihood it was probably too obvious, and you thought, well, the reader will know what I mean. And anytime you have that thought, you need to return to it and say, well, so what? Would it do any harm if I clarify this point, with an extra sentence or 2? And that's really the value of the evidence there, is connecting how evidence explicitly connects backwards to support the overall idea.